Now by the former First Minister of Scotland and leader of the SNP, now leader of the pro-independence Alba Party, Alex Salmond, who's here in Westminster. Nice to see you, Mr. Salmond. I just wonder, you know, the big question is what inspired you to embark on this campaign, which potentially could be political and reputational suicide for you?
Well, let the electorate judge that. I mean, the latest polls are rather good for Alba, showing us getting parliamentary representation, which is no mean feat, because today, Adam, we're celebrating our 3rd anniversary. We've been in existence for precisely 3 weeks. So we've already overtaken the Liberal Democrats in membership. We've got twice as many MPs behind me there as the Scottish Labour Party does. And today's polls show us making a breakthrough of 5 seats. So that's not bad in 3 weeks, Adam. But listen, the electorate will judge in 3 weeks' time. All I can tell you is I'm enjoying myself enormously. OK, but if we look at the opinion polls, you are less popular with the Scottish people than Boris Johnson. And many people are puzzled. I know you're going to tell me that you've had trials and inquiries and your name's been cleared, but many people are going to ask themselves why you won't just issue a public apology to the women that you worked with when you were First Minister for your behaviour. Well, I like the way you wave away the trials. I mean, this is a trial in front of a jury in which I was acquitted. A jury, incidentally, with a majority of women on it in front of a lady judge. And if you knew about the issue, Adam, you know there was an apology issued almost 10 years ago, not for what I was accused of, incidentally. The jury dealt with that. But having been acquitted in the highest criminal court in Scotland, and indeed won my case against the Scottish Government in the highest civil court in Scotland, then I think most people, most fair-minded people, would say that's that. It's time to move on.
Most people,
and I don't really think I don't think Sky Television, incidentally, I don't think Sky Television should be trying to retry me.
Well, I'm not trying to retry you. I'm just being very frank with you. You've got legal protections. But to me, it's surprising that you won't do the simple human thing of saying, I'm sorry for any of the offences which I may have caused, irrespective of your legal position.
Sorry, Adam, let me repeat it. An apology was issued and accepted 10 years ago.
Yeah, 10 years ago, but now you're running, you're trying to come back into politics, you're a party leader, Adam, shouldn't you issue an apology? I mean, to say I apologise for something 10 years ago won't really convince a lot of people.
So, look, just to explain to people, you're coming through a voice in my right-hand side, so if you keep interrupting me, it's going to make the interview impossible because you're being picked up on a microphone here. The issue, Adam, is not only was it 10 years ago I apologised last year when I was tried in front of a court. The jury decided. The jury's in, the verdict's in, Adam. It's time to move on. And incidentally, we've had 2 court cases, criminal court, civil court. We had 3 inquiries. These have happened. They are over with. Let's move on. That's what most fair-minded people in Scotland wants to do. And let's let the people judge whether or not the Alba Party is going to be successful.
OK, is it true? I just want to ask
Sky
you,
Television.
This is evidence given by 2 female civil servants. Is it true that when you were First Minister, you asked female aides to tie your shoelaces, to remove dandruff and to apply hand sanitizer?
No, it was complete rubbish, incidentally. And even, incidentally, the Scottish Government inquiry, the one, incidentally, which was found unlawful, unfair and tainted by bias, didn't establish that fact. So stop believing rubbish, Adam.
Well, it's on the road. OK, so it's not true. Thank you. That's all I needed to know. Right, let's talk about your party and some of your candidates. You've got a candidate, Jim Walker. He described Nicola Sturgeon online as a cow. Do you support that sort of approach to the First Minister?
No, that was before, I mean, that was a Twitter exchange before Jim was a candidate. Jim is one of the most significant economists in the world, incidentally. He was the Asia Money Economist of the Year 11 years running. Right. That's more than Celtic won in terms of Premier Championships, Adam. So let's give Jim some credit as a world-renowned economist, not go into Twitter spats. I mean, Nicola Sturgeon has said some hard things about me, but this campaign, Alba and all our candidates, once they become candidates, go forward in an entirely positive agenda about Scotland's future. That's the discourse I'm hoping to have.
Do you agree?
Even with Sky Television.
Nicola Sturgeon has said this is about personalities and your ego. So do you agree with Jim Walker that Nicola Sturgeon is a cow?
No, and neither does Jim Walker, who apologised for that remark. Right. Of course not. And I haven't made a single personal remark about Nicola Sturgeon or anyone else in this campaign, because I think politics is about national issues, the national interest.
Well, let's talk about national issues. Let's talk about Romanian beggars. We've got Alex Arthur here, another one of your candidates, who tweeted, "Them Romanian beggars in Edinburgh ain't hungry. Just drove past them all ready to switch up begging posts, and all of them fat as big, juicy, overfed pigs." Is that the sort of person you want representing Alba?
Are we talking about Alex Arthur, the world champion, and OBE? Is that the person you're talking about?
Well, I don't know. It's the person who tweeted that.
Well, listen, I'm telling you, a world champion and an OBE. Yes, that's the sort of person we want standing for the Alba Party.
Who calls beggars big, fat, juicy, overfed pigs, do you? That's the sort of person you want representing you.
You know, Adam, even you, I'm sure, have said things you regret on Twitter and apologised for them. Nobody has said anything like that as an Alba candidate. Therefore, let's move on to the substance of the election. Right. Incidentally, I wouldn't take your information from the mainstream press in Scotland. I mean, these are people who have slept through the Sermon on the Mount. Let's talk about politics.
Well, I speak to my colleagues, and I'm very proud to get advice from my colleague James Matthews, our Scotland correspondent, who looks into these things. And I think you would respect James as well.
Jim Matthews is an excellent correspondent. I think Jim Matthews, I would say, in terms of his coverage of Scottish politics, and incidentally, his coverage of the investigations into me is the exception that proves the rule.
James Matthews has raised these issues with me. And just a final one, Margaret Lynch.
James Matthews has raised issues. James Matthews has raised these issues with me, but if I may say so, Adam, he's raised them in a very fair, intelligent, discourse way. A wee bit unlike the interview you're conducting with me right now. I'm
giving you the opportunity as the party leader to speak, to clear things up for your candidates. OK, just one final one. The question of Margaret Lynch. She is alleged by LGBT organisations to have said that they want to lower the age of consent to 10, which they don't. Is there any truth in that?
No truth whatsoever. And if you'd read The Scotsman today, you'd have read how Margaret wrote to The Scotsman explaining the issue, Adam. So stop feeding me this total rubbish and let's get on with politics. Ask me about the election campaign.
I'm going to ask you about the election campaign, but, I mean, you would agree that reputation matters, though, don't you? You know reputation.
Come on, Adam, you can do much better than that.
You know reputation matters, don't you?
Let's talk about politics. Right. Let's talk about how Alba, after 3 weeks, are gaining seats or projected to gain seats in this election. And let me get a sentence out, Adam. You're coming in my right ear. You're interrupting the viewers, never mind me. Let's talk about politics.
I apologise that the COVID rules didn't allow you to come into the studio. Personally, I regret that, but we follow the company rules.
Then adapt to the rules, Adam. Ask me a question.
OK, I'm going to ask you a question. What is the grand strategy? Given Alba's standing, the number of seats it's likely to get, assuming it all goes rosy and you get those half a dozen seats, what is the strategy? What are you going to do with that?
No, if it all goes rosy, Adam, we'll get a lot more than that. But I think it's significant we're making that breakthrough, according to the poll this morning. And one poll's just one poll. We've got 3 weeks to go. Let's hope we do better than that. But even if we took that poll, Adam, that would give the independence parties in the Scottish Parliament 80 seats out of a Parliament of 129, what we call a supermajority. And on that supermajority, we think that Boris Johnson is much less likely to be able to say no to that sort of parliamentary majority than he does if it's just Prime Minister against First Minister, Tories against the SNP, because you'll be taking on an entire Parliament representing an entire nation. That's why we want to cast the debate in that fashion.
Isn't he more likely to say, I've said all along, I'm not going to grant another referendum because they're once in a generation, and even the independence movement amongst itself is fighting like rats in a sack, so why should I bother with that?
Well, I think we'd probably say St Andrews Agreement or Belfast Agreement. And remember, 7 years is the period between referendum agreed by the Cabinet Office, Northern Ireland. I think if it's good enough for Northern Ireland, it's good enough for Scotland. And lo and behold, it's 7 years since the last Scottish referendum. But what matters is the verdict to the Scottish people. And if they put in a supermajority into the Parliament, then I think Boris Johnson is in a much weaker position than if he's just allowed to continue to cast this as Prime Minister against First Minister. Let's make it a Tory Prime Minister against the Scottish nation.
Well, hang on, but that's what you're doing, though, isn't it? That's what you're doing, because he's going to say, is it Nicola Sturgeon or is it Alex Salmond? That your re-entry into politics gives him that opportunity.
You know, Adam, I did a press conference yesterday with 104 international journalists from around Europe. Not one of them asked me the question about having a variety of parties, because they all operate under proportional systems like the one we have in Scotland, where it's normal to have lots of political parties. Now, I think it strengthens the independence movement to have a number of political parties advocating independence. It increases the appeal and the breadth for the movement. That's what Alba does. What's
not normal is to have a former party leader and national leader to defect and run against his successor. That's quite unusual.
Well, look, there's 15 parties in the Danish Parliament. There's about 9 in the Finnish Parliament, arguing in some cases for similar objectives. The difference between Alba and the SNP, which is the real question, is a question of whether we get to independence. It's a question of urgency. And the Alba policy is that in 1 month's time, if we get that supermajority, which the poll this morning suggests, we'll lay down a motion instructing the Scottish Government to open negotiations with the Westminster Government on independence for Scotland. So the difference between Alba and the SNP, and even more so the Greens, who are pretty weak on independence, is a question of urgency. We think it's an immediate priority and we should get on with it.
If you were successful and you obtained Scottish independence, would you be prepared, and membership of the European Union, would you be prepared to see a border across Great Britain?
Well, you say membership of the European Union. I mean, one of the policies we're discussing this weekend at our second conference after 3 weeks in existence is our whole approach to Europe. Because we would see that the immediate priority, now that Scotland has been dragged out of the European Union against our will, our immediate priority is to get back into the single market, because we can do that relatively quickly. Whereas, as you're well aware, European Union membership will take best will in the world a number of years.
Doesn't make any difference.
But if you can get back into the single market, then of course it opens up a range of possibilities. You know, Norway, for example, is in the single market, but not in the customs union. You could have a customs union with the rest of the UK, which of course has significant implications in terms of the type of border you would have between Scotland and England. One thing's for sure, you'd be in a common travel area.
That's exactly what's going on the island of Ireland at the moment, and what we're seeing is it's very difficult to avoid a border. We've had an east-west border.
I'll tell you what's going on in the island of Ireland just now. A reckless Tory Prime Minister has jeopardised and sacrificed the peace in Northern Ireland that so many people have strove for over the last 40 years. Because he doesn't have the wisdom or the vision to understand the implications of his policy. Let's hope that Boris Johnson doesn't make the same mistakes as regards Scotland.
The consequence is if we have a situation where Scotland was in the single market and presumably the customs union, there would have to be a border, wouldn't there, of some kind across the United Kingdom.
Well, the position would depend if you were in or not in the customs union. The point I was going to make to you that the common travel area, which has existed in these islands since the 1920s, would still prevail. So Adam Boulton, if he so wished, with no inhibition whatsoever, could come up to Edinburgh once the COVID rules are relaxed and interview me in front of the Scottish Parliament if I am successful in being elected as an MSP with no restrictions whatsoever.
I wouldn't be able to bring a ham sandwich with me, would I? That's the situation that people are experiencing, lorry drivers going into France, for example. So there would be a police border, wouldn't there?
I mean, there's a serious matter, incidentally, about food standards. I mean, given the world that Boris Johnson wants to take this country in, I mean, not ham sandwiches, but just think of the implications in terms of food additives. I mean, there are good arguments for having food protection, and in a post-COVID environment, I think people are going to be extraordinarily sensitive and want the maximum environmental protection for their foodstuffs and other things. So don't dismiss the the regulatory checks on food substances, Adam, that would be not understanding some of the lessons and the harsh lessons we've been taught over the last year.
Will you and Nicola Sturgeon, after this election, will you have a joint campaign for a Scottish referendum and a joint campaign for a yes vote if that referendum takes place?
Oh, yes. I mean, not just with Nicola Sturgeon, but with everybody prepared to campaign for yes. I mean, one of the things I learned, one of the mistakes I made, Adam, is as First Minister, although we were hugely successful in making the SNP the dominant force in Scottish politics, we didn't move the dial on independence until 2014. So we became the dominant force in Scottish politics, but support for independence was still stuck about 30%. It was only in 2014, in that high, glorious summer, when the Yes campaign broadened to include a whole range of multifarious groups arguing for independence from a different point of view, that we started to have the momentum behind Yes. And if I was to express Alba as one thing, I would say it's that glorious Yes diverse movement reborn in the form of a political party, optimistic, forward-looking, open-minded, and arguing constructively with anyone who's prepared to support the cause of independence for Scotland.
And finally, if that seems likely, Boris Johnson does not agree to a binding referendum, would you insist on the holding of an indicative referendum, whatever the position in Westminster is?
I think there's a range of tactics can be employed, and that's certainly one of them. But listen, if I could make David Cameron, as a Tory Prime Minister, in trouble now, but a much more impressive Tory Prime Minister than Boris Johnson will ever be, if I could make David Cameron back down in 2012, then the Yes movement can make Boris Johnson back down in 2021.
OK, you raised David Cameron. What do you make of this Westminster lobbying scandal?
Well, I mean, it does look pretty bad, but listen, we haven't heard the full facts. There's going to be, I think, 7 inquiries I'm counting, and I think we should give him the benefit of the doubt till he hears his full account. But I mean, the lobbying scandal looks pretty bad. It doesn't alter the fact that when he was in office, despite the fact I disagreed with him in just about everything, including Scottish independence, then he looked like a Prime Minister. But he'll get his opportunity in front of these 7 inquiries to explain what on earth was going on.
OK, thank you very much indeed. Alex Salmond there, the leader of the Alba Party in Scotland.
Pleasure, Adam.